My name is Serena Caldwell. I'm 38, and I've talked families through the worst news of their lives without my voice ever breaking. But the day I found out the truth, I sat alone in my car in a parking garage and said 6 words out loud to nobody. And those 6 words were the quietest demolition you've ever seen. Let me take you back to a Thursday evening in the maternity wing. I just finished a 12-hour shift and I was cutting through that hallway the way I always did, past the balloons and the little pink and blue signs, when I saw her, Donna Hartwell, my ex-mother-in-law. She had a way of holding herself like she was always about to receive an award. She spotted me by the elevator bank and didn't hesitate for a single second. She walked straight over, chin lifted, and she said it loud enough for 2 nurses and an orderly to hear every syllable. "Leaving you was the finest thing my son ever did, and now he has a beautiful baby with your closest friend. 7 years of being called the hollow one, packed into one breath in a fluorescent hallway." I didn't flinch. I pressed my thumb against the face of my grandmother's watch, the way I've done since I was 9 years old when something was too big to react to yet. And I looked Donna dead in the eye and said quietly, calmly, like I was reading a chart, "Is that what you believe?" 5 minutes later, a man walked through those maternity doors that nobody in that building was expecting. And the one name everyone in this story had been so careful to keep out of any official record was about to be said out loud in a courtroom. Stay with me, because I want to tell you exactly how a quiet woman with a grandmother's watch and a very good lawyer brought an entire house of lies down without raising her voice once. Let me back up further because the smile came before the man did, and you need to understand who I was before any of this happened to understand why I handled it the way I did. I grew up in a small river town in eastern Tennessee, the kind of place where the same 20 families have been in each other's business since before your grandparents were born. My mother waitressed double shifts. My dad ran a hardware supply route until his knees gave out. I worked through college cleaning hospital rooms, which is how I fell in love with the place, and then worked through medical school on loans and stubbornness. I became an ER physician not because it was glamorous, but because I was good at staying still when everything else was moving. That's the skill nobody teaches you. Stillness under pressure. You either have it or you don't. The hospital was the first place in my life where nobody looked at me like I was temporary, where I was defined entirely by what I could do, not where I came from or who my people were. I could hold a frightened child's hand and set their collarbone and tell them in a voice that didn't waver that they were going to be absolutely fine. And they believed me, because I believed it first. That steadiness was the thing I was proudest of. It was also, I would learn, the thing that made me dangerous to lie to. I married Thomas Hartwell at 29. He was the kind of man who made strangers feel like old friends. He remembered your dog's name, your sister's job, the town where your mother grew up. Half the county would have vouched for his character without blinking. And for the first 3 years, I would have too. We wanted children. We tried for a long time, and nothing came of it. And the absence of it sat in our house, like a guest neither of us had invited and neither of us knew how to ask to leave. After about 2 years of trying, I did what any physician does when faced with an unanswered question. I suggested we both get tested. Basic workup, standard blood work, the kind of thing I ordered for patients on a Tuesday without thinking twice. Thomas refused. He laughed it off first, then got cold about it. Said the Hartwell men didn't have those problems. He wrapped it in a little speech about faith, about patience, about letting nature take its course. I pushed once. I pushed twice. I let it go because you cannot physically drag a grown man to a clinic, and because I still believed back then that silence was a reasonable kind of patience. I went and got tested on my own. My results came back completely normal. I remember sitting in my car reading that paper, relieved and confused in equal measure. If it wasn't me, then what was it? I couldn't force an answer that Thomas wasn't willing to participate in finding. And the longer we went without one, the easier it became for the people around us to write their own version. By then, Thomas had already started saying things, quiet things to his mother first, that maybe the problem was mine, that maybe I just couldn't. I didn't know yet how far a whispered lie can travel when the right person decides to carry it, and Donna Hartwell was precisely the right person. She'd raised Thomas alone after his father died young. She'd built her entire sense of self around the idea that her son was a success story, proof that her hard years had meant something. So when Thomas handed her that story about me, she didn't question it. She picked it up and she ran with it, the way you run with something you desperately need to be true. It started small. A sigh at a neighborhood dinner, a hand on someone's arm, a lowered voice. Poor Thomas. He wanted a family so badly. Then it grew teeth. At a church potluck that fall, Donna introduced me to a visiting woman with an expression of practiced sorrow. "This is Serena," she said. "Thomas's wife. She's a doctor, you know. Such a shame about the children." The woman gave me a slow, sympathetic nod, and I understood that whatever story had been told about me had already arrived in the room before I did. I stood there in my good blouse holding a paper plate, and Donna patted my hand like I was the one who needed comforting. Then she said the line she'd go on saying for years, the way some people say a blessing before a meal. Some women simply aren't made for it. She said it with total certainty. She believed it completely, and that was the most disturbing part of all. She wasn't being deliberately cruel. She was repeating what her son had handed her, polished and already packaged. She had no idea the words were a lie wearing her own voice. I drove home that night and didn't say anything to Thomas. I should have. But I was still waiting for the truth to sort itself out. I had believed that my whole life. Do good work quietly. Tell the truth and let it stand. People will eventually see who you actually are. It had served me well in medicine. It failed me completely in my marriage. Nina Cole had been my closest friend since we were 16. We met in a high school biology lab and stayed close through everything that came after. My move across the state for school, her series of career changes that never quite landed, a decade and a half of friendship. She was the one I called when my mother had her first stroke. She stood up at my wedding in a burgundy dress and cried so hard during my vows that she had to borrow a tissue from the woman in the pew behind her. So when the church talk started wearing on me, Nina was who I leaned on. She'd come over with takeout and wine and let me talk, and she always said exactly the right thing, or what felt like the right thing. Looking back, every word of comfort she offered had a small, careful hook in it. "You're so accomplished, Serena. Maybe motherhood simply isn't your path. Thomas loves you. Don't let his mother get in your head. You're whole without a baby. You always were." Kind words, technically, but they always landed on the same bruise. They always circled back to the thing I supposedly lacked. I didn't notice then how often her eyes drifted to Thomas across a room, or how she'd started knowing details about his schedule that I hadn't mentioned. I was too busy being grateful to have one person who didn't seem to be judging me. She'd sit on my couch and tell me I deserved better, and I'd nod, never once imagining she meant she deserved my life. People who take what's yours rarely do it all at once. They borrow it in small pieces until the day you look up and find them standing inside it, like they were always meant to be there. I trusted Nina completely. That was the second mistake I didn't know I was making. Thomas filed for divorce on a Wednesday. I came home from a night shift to find a legal envelope on the counter and his side of the closet half empty. He didn't even tell me himself. By the weekend, he'd moved into Nina's apartment on the other side of town, and the story was already written and circulating before I'd fully understood what had happened. The version going around was neat and devastating. Serena was cold. Serena was married to her career. Serena couldn't give him the family he deserved. And what man doesn't deserve a family? Donna made sure every church pew heard it. Nina, my Nina, said nothing to correct a single word. The two people who had known me longest let me become a cautionary tale, and I didn't fight it because fighting felt like admitting there was something to fight about. I didn't post anything. I didn't call anyone to defend my name. I went to work the next morning and stabilized a man who'd had a stroke in a parking lot and told his terrified wife he was going to make it. And that felt like the only true thing I did all week. If you've ever swallowed a lie about yourself to keep the peace, to protect a marriage, a friendship, a reputation you'd spent years building, then you know exactly what that tastes like. It tastes like something sharp that you're not allowed to name out loud. The peace I was keeping so carefully wasn't even mine to keep. It belonged to the people who were lying about me. They needed me quiet. Comment the word truth right now if you've ever been in that place, because the silence didn't last. I want to tell you about the morning a hospital board taught me that some things are worth saying in public. The story stopped being about my marriage the day it walked into my hospital. I'd been in line for years to lead the emergency department. I'd written half the triage protocols the county now ran on. That job was built from my own hands, and everyone in the building knew it. Then the whispers found the credentialing committee, not facts. There were no facts to find, just the shape of them. Dr. Caldwell's personal life suggests instability. There are questions about her judgment under pressure. Did you hear about the divorce? About what the Hartwells say? One board member who played golf with Thomas's uncle began asking pointed questions about whether I could be trusted to lead under stress, as if I hadn't spent the last decade staying composed while people bled on my table. When the position was announced, it went to someone with half my tenure and none of my protocols. They told me I was a strong candidate. They said it was an incredibly difficult decision. They did not tell me the real reason. But I'd grown up in a small town. I knew the sound of a verdict dressed up as a compliment. That night, something changed in me permanently. A lie about my body had cost me my marriage, and I'd endured it because I thought that was the decent thing to do. But now the same lie was reaching into the one thing I had never let anyone touch: my work, my name. The thing I had actually bled for. I sat in my car in the hospital lot the same way I'd sat years earlier reading my normal test results, and I understood for the first time that the silence I'd been so proud of had a price, and someone else had been quietly running it up on my behalf. A colleague I trusted gave me the name of a lawyer named Margaret Cho. Her office was above a dry cleaning shop on Broad Street, and she had the particular stillness of someone who has heard every version of every story and still manages to be surprised by the details. I told her everything: the marriage, the church talk, the board, the job. She listened without interrupting, which is rarer than it sounds, and when I finished, she set down her pen. "What you're describing could be defamation," she said. "Possibly false light. But I'll be straight with you. It's difficult. To win, we'd have to prove 3 things: a specific false statement, that it was spread to other people, and that it caused you real, measurable harm. The harm part is solid," she said. "A lost promotion is a number. A salary gap is a number. That part we can build. And the false part?" Margaret looked at me over her glasses. "That's the part you have to be willing to fight about in public. They'll argue the statements were true, that you really couldn't have children. To win, you'd have to prove it wasn't you." I felt my stomach drop because my results were normal, but normal doesn't tell you whose fault the quiet was. It only says it wasn't mine. I almost stood up and left. The idea of inviting a courtroom to examine my body felt unbearable. Then Margaret said the thing I needed to hear. Silence isn't a virtue when it's costing you your career. Sometimes the most decent thing you can do for yourself is make them prove what they're saying out loud. I spent 2 weeks going over it. I'm not a person who makes fast decisions. I make them the way I read a difficult chart, slowly and carefully, and then all at once. I wrote down everything I stood to lose: The community I'd grown up around, my standing in a town that already half believed the worst, the way people would talk, calling me vindictive, calling me bitter, saying I was the kind of woman who sues her ex-husband's family out of spite. I knew exactly how that story would be written because they'd already written most of it. But then I wrote the other column, my name, my work, the truth, and the simple fact that I had done absolutely nothing wrong and was being punished for it anyway. I kept coming back to one thing. I wasn't doing this to hurt Thomas. I was doing it so that a hospital board would stop believing a story that had never been true, so that the next time my name came up in a room I wasn't in, it came up clean. That was the line I drew. This wouldn't be revenge. Revenge is loud and hungry, and it never arrives where you send it. This would be the truth, said once, in a place where it counted, by someone who had finally decided she was finished carrying a lie that belonged to someone else entirely. I called Margaret on a Monday morning before my shift. I told her I was in. Good, she said, then let's make them say it under oath. I hung up and walked into the trauma bay and had the steadiest hands I'd had in a year. A made-up mind turns out to be its own kind of calm. Margaret drafted the complaint over the following weeks. It named the specific statements, the dates, the witnesses who'd been present. It laid out the lost promotion and the salary difference and the documented damage to my professional reputation. Reading it was a strange experience, my entire quiet humiliation, reorganized into numbered paragraphs with weight and consequence. When it was filed, the news moved through town faster than a weather alert. Serena Caldwell is suing the Hartwells. Donna was incandescent. She told the women's circle I'd become godless with bitterness. She doubled down on every word she'd ever said, which, as Margaret explained to me later, was exactly what she'd hoped Donna would do. Thomas stayed quiet at first. Nina did too, but I started getting messages. Some cruel, some curious, a handful quietly supportive, from women who recognized something in my story that had happened in their own lives in different shapes. One said simply, "Good for you." They did the same thing to my sister. I didn't respond to any of them. I just kept showing up to work and let the case move at the speed of the law, which is to say slowly and sometimes with excruciating patience. Margaret told me the other side's response would shape everything. She explained that they had two roads available to them. They could argue the statements were just opinion, personal feelings, nothing legally actionable. That road would be frustrating but survivable for them. Or they could plant their flag and claim the statements were simply true, that I really had been the problem. That road, she said, tapping her pen on the desk, is the one I'm hoping they take. Why? She smiled. Because then they have to prove it. And to prove it, they have to open a door. They took the second road. Of course they did. Thomas's lawyer filed a response arguing that the statements about me weren't defamation at all, because they were accurate. The infertility, they claimed on paper, was medical, and it was mine. When Margaret called to tell me, I could hear something almost like satisfaction underneath her measured tone. They just said the magic words, she told me. Truth is a defense in defamation law. But here's the thing they didn't think through. She paused a beat. To prove the statement is true, to prove you were the infertile one, they would have to put both of your medical pictures in front of the court. Reproductive records are private and no judge releases them lightly. We'd have to convince the court it was relevant and necessary. But they just argued under oath that the cause was definitively you and not him. They cannot make that claim and then refuse to let anyone look at him. That's the crack. It's not a door swinging open. It's a crack. And I can absolutely work with a crack. I sat down slowly at my kitchen table. Meaning, I said. Meaning, Margaret said. They just put Thomas's own fertility history in play. He spent years hiding behind it was her. By swearing to that in court, he may have just handed us the legal standing to finally ask about him. No guarantees, but it's the best opening we've had. For 6 years, I had been the one whose body was discussed at church dinners and neighborhood gatherings. And in trying to make that official, in trying to win by saying it loudly in a courtroom, the Hartwells had done the one thing none of them had ever been willing to do. They had opened the door to looking at Thomas. I thought about him refusing the tests all those years ago, the quick deflections, the way the conversation had always slammed shut the moment it turned toward him. I didn't say anything to Margaret yet, but a thread I'd buried a long time ago had just moved, and I felt it. That night I couldn't sleep, so I did what I always do when something won't settle. I went back through the timeline in my head, carefully, the way you reread a chart for the detail you missed the first time. And there it was, 6 years back. A morning early in the marriage when Thomas had driven to the city alone for what he called a routine checkup. He'd been gone all day. He came home different, quiet in a way that wasn't like him, sharp with me over something small. He poured a drink before dinner, which was not something he did on weeknights. I'd asked if everything was okay. He said the doctor was useless and the trip was a waste of time, and he changed the subject so abruptly it almost left a mark. And here was the detail I couldn't stop returning to. After that day, he never once brought up getting tested again. Before the city trip, he'd at least kept up the pretense of taking the question seriously. After it, the subject was simply closed. And in that same stretch of weeks, the first whispers about me had begun. I'd filed it away at the time as a man being irritable after a wasted afternoon. I hadn't connected it to anything because I hadn't been looking for a lie. You don't audit the people you love. But now, with Margaret's words still in my ears, that quiet day in the city looked less like a wasted trip and more like the moment when a decision got made. I didn't have proof. I need to be clear about that. I had a memory and a feeling, which is nothing in a courtroom. But it was enough to tell Margaret where to point. And the next morning, that's exactly what I did. Margaret listened to the story about the city trip without writing anything down, which I'd come to understand meant she was paying the closest possible attention. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. On its own, it's nothing, she said, a memory of a bad mood. But it's a reason to ask the right question. She explained what came next, because the other side had put my fertility at issue, and because they'd argued under oath that the cause was definitively me and not him. She could now file a motion asking the court to compel production of Thomas's own relevant medical records. If he wants to claim it was you, she said, the law allows me to ask whether it was him. You can't open a door halfway. That's not how this works. She filed the motion the following week. Thomas's lawyer fought it hard, so hard that I understood immediately I'd touched something real, because nobody fights that ferociously over nothing. They argued privacy. They argued relevance. They argued every possible angle that might keep that one folder closed. The hearing was scheduled and I had to sit with the not knowing, which for a person like me is its own particular kind of suffering. I'm accustomed to ordering a test and receiving an answer. This was different. This was asking a judge for permission to even look. I went back to my shifts and sutured wounds and read scans and tried not to think about a file I'd never seen sitting in some city clinic that might say everything or might say nothing at all. Margaret told me to be patient. Courts move slowly on purpose, she said. It gives the truth time to stop being frightening. I wasn't frightened of the truth. I'd never been frightened of the truth. I was frightened they'd find a way to keep me from it. Before the judge ruled, I had to sign a verified complaint, a sworn version of everything, every statement, every date, every witness, with my name attached under penalty of perjury. Margaret set it on the desk between us, a thick stack with small colored tabs marking every place I needed to sign. Read all of it, she said, then sign only what you know is true. So I read it, every line. The neighborhood dinner, the pastor's wife, the exact words Donna had said at the church potluck, the ones about how some women simply aren't made for it, the board meeting, the salary I had lost, Reading my own quiet years laid out in numbered paragraphs did something unexpected to me. It made the lie look as thin as it actually was. I picked up the pen Margaret handed me, and I noticed the smell of the room. Not the clean antiseptic of my hospital, my old hiding place, but paper and ink and the faint smell of dry cleaning from the shop below. For years, that hospital smell had meant safety, the one place where nobody called me hollow. Now here I was, somewhere else entirely, somewhere I'd had to walk out into the open to reach, and I wasn't hiding anymore. I pressed the pen to the line and wrote my name, clean and certain, the steadiest thing I'd signed in years. The ruling came on a gray Tuesday in the middle of a quiet shift. Margaret called, and I stepped into the equipment room to take it, surrounded by folded gowns and saline bags, my heart doing the thing it never does while I'm working. The judge granted it, she said, with limits, but granted. She walked me through it carefully. Because the defense had affirmatively claimed the infertility was mine, the court found that Thomas's own relevant fertility records had become, in the judge's words, presumptively discoverable. Not automatically public, not a free for all, the records would be produced under a protective order, reviewed first by the attorneys and the court, used only as the case required. It's not a guarantee, Margaret said. We don't know what's in the file. Maybe there's nothing, but they cannot keep it closed anymore. I stood in that supply room and let out a breath I felt like I had been holding for 7 years. Across town, I learned later, the news landed very differently. Thomas's lawyer reportedly requested a private meeting the same afternoon. Donna called Margaret's office twice and was told the attorney was unavailable. And for the first time, the people who had spent years deciding what was true about my body went a little pale at the thought of a court deciding what was true about Thomas. I didn't celebrate. I want you to understand that. I didn't text anyone. I finished my shift and charted my patients and drove back to my apartment alone. But that night, I slept all the way through for the first time in months because I knew the folder was coming. And folders, unlike people, don't know how to lie. The first sign that something was falling apart on their end didn't come from Thomas or Donna. It came from Nina. She texted me out of nowhere after a year of complete silence. "Please don't do this," she wrote. "Think about the baby." I read it 3 times. We hadn't spoken since the divorce. She had taken my husband and my life and never once reached out. And now she was begging me to stop a lawsuit that on its surface had nothing to do with her. That was the part that caught. The suit was between me and Thomas and Donna. It was about statements made about my body, about a job I'd lost. Why would Nina, who had supposedly won everything, be frightened of it? Why would a woman holding the baby and the husband and the house be texting her ex-best friend at midnight asking her not to dig? People who beg you to stop digging usually know what's in the ground. I'd learned that. I didn't answer her. I sat with it, turning it over, feeling the shape of something I couldn't see clearly yet. Here's what I understood by then, and what I want you to hear if you've ever been the steady one in a storm. The people most afraid of the truth are rarely the ones it's supposed to land on. I wasn't angry at Nina. I was curious, bone deep and wide awake curious. If a quiet woman finally finding her spine is the kind of story that gets to you, hit subscribe right now so the next part finds you, and tell me in the comments where you would have stopped, because I almost stopped twice. But Nina's text didn't make me want to stop. It made me want to keep going. A frightened person had just told me, without intending to, that there was more in the ground than I knew. The folder arrived 8 days later. I want to be precise about how, because it matters. I did not see it first. I couldn't have, and I wouldn't have. I'm a physician, and there are records I have no right to touch. Not my ex-husband's, not anyone's. That is the law, and it is a good one. The records went to Margaret through the proper channel, under the protective order the judge had set. She reviewed them with the other side's attorney present, the way it was supposed to work. Then she called me and asked me to come to her office, which she had never done before. I knew, before I sat down. She had the particular expression of someone about to hand you something heavy and true. 7 years ago, she said, Thomas went to a clinic in the city, the one you remembered. She slid a single sheet across the desk toward me, just the line that mattered, the rest blacked out under the court seal. The diagnosis was a word I had written on patient charts 100 times, azoospermia, no measurable sperm. Thomas had been told in plain clinical language that he could not father a biological child. 7 years ago. The same week he came home quiet and changed and poured a drink before dinner and permanently closed the subject. I sat very still. Margaret watched me the way you watch someone after you've delivered difficult test results. I didn't cry and I didn't raise my voice. I felt something enormous and quiet rearrange itself inside me, like a dislocated joint going back where it belongs. For 6 years, I had been the broken one, the barren one, the quiet shame of the Hartwell family, and the man who had let an entire town believe that had known the whole time that the empty house was his. I drove home with that single sheet of paper folded in my bag and didn't turn on the radio. I expected to feel triumphant. I'd braced for it, honestly, even worried about it a little, because I didn't want to become someone who finds satisfaction in another person's collapse. But triumph never came. What came instead was something stranger and much sadder: grief. 6 years of my life had been spent absorbing a wound that was never mine to absorb. Every pitying look at a church dinner, every "some women simply aren't made for it," every night I'd laid awake wondering what was wrong with me. All of it had been a story Thomas wrote to cover a truth he could not face about himself. He had handed his shame to me and let me wear it in public for years, and his mother had pinned it on with both hands. I sat in my car in the lot outside my apartment, the way I always seem to end up sitting in cars at the turning points of my life, and I said something out loud to nobody. The same 6 words I'd said to Donna in that hospital hallway. "Is that what you believe?" Only now I understood what I'd been asking all along. I wasn't broken. I had never been broken. The relief of that didn't arrive like something spectacular. It arrived like a long exhale, like the first full breath after months of shallow ones. And underneath it, a new question was already forming, one I couldn't push back down. If Thomas could not father a child 7 years ago, if the clinic was right, if the diagnosis held, then the baby boy Donna had announced in that maternity hallway, the son Thomas had been showing off around town, the child he had left me to go and have with my best friend, could not be his. The arithmetic was quiet and brutal. A man with that diagnosis does not father a child without medical intervention that Thomas had never sought, which meant either the clinic had been catastrophically wrong, which happens but rarely, or the baby everyone believed was Thomas. Hartwell's son had been fathered by someone else entirely. I wasn't going to pretend I knew which, but I knew it was a question with a real answer. And suddenly, Nina's midnight text made a horrible and perfect kind of sense. "Please don't do this. Think about the baby." She wasn't worried about my lawsuit hurting Thomas's feelings. She was worried about what a room full of medical records might force into the open. Because Nina knew something the rest of the town didn't. She knew whose baby it actually was. I want to be careful here about what I did and didn't do, because it matters to me that I did this right. I did not go looking into the baby's records. I had no right to, and I wouldn't have. That child was innocent in all of this, and I have never once wished that baby anything but well. What I had was a contradiction sitting in plain sight, created entirely by the Hartwells' own legal defense. They had sworn the infertility was mine. The record said it was Thomas's, and a healthy baby across town said someone was lying about something much bigger than a marriage. I called Margaret. "I think there's more in the ground," I told her. She didn't pause for even a second. "Then we let the court find it," she said. "Not us, the court." The man who had walked into the hospital room that day, the one I mentioned at the very beginning of this story, had a name: James Okafor. I didn't know him then, I learned about him the way I learned everything in this story, slowly and properly through channels that don't lie. It turned out that during the months Nina and Thomas were becoming whatever they were, while Thomas was still telling the world his wife was the broken one, Nina had been involved with someone else as well. James, a quiet man by every account, who had been led to believe the relationship was something more than it was. When she chose Thomas, Nina had cut James off completely, blocked his number, never told him she was expecting, never breathed a word about a due date or a hospital or a birth. She'd gambled that he would simply disappear, that he would never connect the pieces. But the timing hadn't sat right with him. He'd kept asking quiet questions of the few people they'd both known. And that very morning, one of those people had let the hospital name and the approximate date slip. So he came. He came to see the child he suspected might be his. And the moment he walked through that door, the one person Nina had been so certain would never find her, the color drained out of her face completely. That's the picture I want you to hold. Donna by the elevators, certain her son's perfect life had proven me worthless. And 5 steps behind her, a man walking through the maternity doors who was the living proof that the perfect life was built on the same kind of lie they'd buried me under for years. I didn't engineer that moment. I didn't even understand it when it happened. I just looked at Donna calmly and asked if that was really what she believed. And then a door opened and a stranger walked through it, and an entire house of lies began quietly coming down without my lifting a single hand. James, it would turn out, had questions a court could answer, and in a town where everyone had been so certain they knew the truth about my body, the truth about everyone else's was about to get its day. Mark knew. That's the part I keep returning to, the thing that turns this story from sad to genuinely unforgivable. He had known for 7 years that he could not father a child. So when Nina became pregnant, he knew with absolute certainty that the baby wasn't his, and he took it anyway. He stood in front of his mother and his church and his entire small world and let them believe he had made a son. The son his barren first wife had failed to give him. He used a child who wasn't his to put the final period on the sentence he'd been writing about me for years. The cruelty isn't even the affair or the lie about my body, though those are bad enough on their own. It's that he looked at a baby he knew couldn't be his and saw first and foremost a prop, proof of something he needed the world to believe about him. Every time I tried to reach for sympathy for him, I hit that same wall. He'd had 100 chances to let the truth come out quietly and let me go with my name intact. Instead, he built a monument to a lie and put a real child on top of it. When Margaret told me that Thomas's lawyer had gone quiet, no new motions, no new fight, just a request to discuss resolving the matter, I understood exactly why. He wasn't afraid of losing the lawsuit anymore. He was afraid of what the lawsuit would say out loud in front of everyone about the son he'd been parading around. He had spent 7 years controlling the story, and for the first time, the story was about to get completely away from him. Donna came to see me before the hearing. She showed up at my apartment on a Sunday in her church clothes, and I nearly didn't open the door. When I did, she looked older than I remembered, and smaller, which I hadn't expected. She didn't apologize. I want to be honest about that because for a moment, I thought she might. She stood in my doorway and asked me in a voice with a fracture running through it to drop the suit. Not for Thomas, she said. For the family. For the baby. For the name. And as she spoke, I saw something I hadn't expected to see in her. I saw a woman who had been lied to by her own son for 7 years. A widow who had poured everything she had into one child and built her whole identity around the certainty that he was good. She hadn't spread those cruel words because she was evil. She'd spread them because Thomas had handed them to her, and she had loved him too much to ever question them. For one breath, standing in my own doorway, I felt for her. She was human. She had been used too. But then she said it again. The line she'd carried for years, except this time it came out as a plea instead of a pronouncement. Some women simply aren't made for it, Serena. Why drag everyone through this over something that can't be changed? And I understood that even now, standing at the very edge of the truth, she would rather protect the lie than release it. Sympathy is not the same as surrender. I could see her pain and still refuse to carry her son's shame one more day. "Carol," I said quietly, "go home. The mud was never mine." She left without another word. I closed the door and didn't feel cruel. I felt finished. Thomas's lawyer offered a settlement, a quiet one. They'd pay a sum, issue a private retraction to the hospital board, clear my professional record. In exchange, I'd agree to seal everything and never speak of it publicly. Margaret laid the offer on her desk and watched me. "It's a good deal on paper," she said. "You'd get your name back at the board, the job back in play, everything you said you came for." She wasn't wrong. By the numbers, it was a win. My reputation restored. The position back in play. All I had to do was let the truth be whispered in a back room and then locked in a drawer forever. While Donna kept saying her line at church gatherings, while Thomas kept showing off a son who wasn't his, and while the story about the broken doctor stayed half alive in the corners of town where private retractions never actually reach, I thought about it for a long time. Then I told Margaret no, not out of spite. I want to be clear about that because the difference matters enormously to me. I didn't refuse because I wanted to watch Thomas burn. I refused because a private truth is just a quieter version of the same lie. For 6 years, they had said it about me out loud, in churches and at community dinners where everyone could hear. The correction had to live in the same place. Not a whisper, not a sealed drawer. The truth, said once, where it counted, in front of the same people who had believed the lie. "I'm not going to whisper an apology for a wound he handed me," I told Margaret. "I'll say it once where it counts, and then I'm done carrying it." Margaret capped her pen and smiled. "Then we go to court," she said. "Wear something you can breathe in." The hearing was held in the county courthouse on a bright, cold morning. I'd expected to feel nervous. I had run 1,000 emergency calls without my hands shaking. But this felt different, because what was on the table this time was me. The room filled in a way that told you everything about how small towns work. 2 members of the hospital board were there to see what they had gotten wrong. Several women from Donna's church circle, the same ones who had nodded along to her pity for years. Donna herself, rigid in the second row. Thomas beside his lawyer, pale and slightly damp in a suit that no longer fit him right. And Nina, near the back, holding herself very still, with James sitting 2 rows behind her, whose presence she could feel without turning around. I sat at Margaret's table and felt the whole architecture of the past 7 years gathered in one room. For 6 years, these people had been the audience to my humiliation. They had watched a woman get quietly labeled and said nothing, or worse, repeated it. Now they were the audience to something else. That was the part I had insisted on. The lie had been public. The truth had to be public too, in front of the same eyes, or it would never fully undo what had been done. Margaret didn't raise her voice once. That's what I remember most clearly. She built the case the way you build a diagnosis, one finding at a time, calm and unhurried, until the conclusion was the only one left standing. She established the statements, the dates, the witnesses who had been present. Donna's own words, repeated at potlucks and prayer groups, that some women simply aren't made for it. She established the harm, the lost promotion, the salary differential, the documented damage to my professional name. Then she addressed the defense's own claim that the statements were simply true, and she asked the court to consider the records the defense had forced into play by making that very argument. Under the protective order, only the necessary line was read. 7 years ago, Thomas Hartwell had been diagnosed at a city clinic with a condition that made fathering a biological child medically impossible. The room changed temperature. I watched the church women turn to look at Donna, who had gone the color of paper. Then Margaret, gentle as anything, laid the contradiction on the table. The one the Hartwells had built with their own hands. The defense had sworn the empty marriage was my fault. The record said it was Thomas's. And there was, by the family's own loud and public account, a baby boy. She noted that the question of that child's paternity had become relevant to custody and support proceedings now before a related court, and that genetic testing in those proceedings had not supported Thomas's biological paternity. She said it plainly and without any drama, the way you'd read a lab value to a colleague. And that was when Thomas stood up. "You can't." His voice cracked across the courtroom. "That's not." The judge told him to sit. Donna was on her feet too, saying my name like an accusation, saying it couldn't be true, saying I had twisted everything. The two of them, loud and unraveling, while I sat perfectly still at the table and said nothing at all. Donna turned on me then, the way frightened people reach for whatever's nearest. Her composure was gone. The certainty that had carried her through 30 years of women's circle meetings cracked wide open, and out of the wreckage came the only words she had left. "Some women simply aren't made for it," she said, her voice breaking, pointing across the room at me. "Some women just aren't." She couldn't even finish the sentence the second time. And I stood up slowly because I had waited 7 years and I was not going to rush this moment. I didn't raise my voice. I kept it flat and clear. The voice I use when I have to tell a family something true and hard, the voice that is calmer than any room around it can stand. "You're right, Donna," I said. The whole courtroom went silent. "You are exactly right. One person in this marriage was never built to have children." I let that sit for a moment. I looked at Thomas, then back at his mother. The file only ever had his name on it. Donna's hand dropped. Thomas had his face in his hands, and the women from the church circle, the ones who had nodded along to my ruin for years, sat there with the truth finally settling over them, rearranging everything they thought they had understood. I wasn't built wrong. I had never been built wrong. The man who had let an entire town believe otherwise was sitting 6 feet away from me, coming apart, while the calm woman he'd called broken stood steady on her own 2 feet. I had said it once out loud where it counted, and I was already finally setting it down. What followed wasn't dramatic in the way you might expect. There was no shouting match. No one was removed from the room. It was quieter than that, and somehow worse for the Hartwells because of it. Thomas didn't deny it again. He couldn't. He sat with his head down while his own attorney asked for a recess, and when the judge granted it, he didn't move. He stayed there, hunched in that ill-fitting suit, a man watching 7 years of careful storytelling collapse in a single morning. The church women gathered their coats and their bags and filed out with their eyes down, and I knew that by evening the real story would be moving through town, at least as fast as the lie ever had. Donna followed them out, smaller than I had ever seen her, no longer running any campaign, and Nina slipped out during the recess, but not before James rose from his seat 2 rows back and walked out the same door right behind her. The question of that baby now headed somewhere it could finally be answered honestly. I sat at the table and let it all empty out around me. Margaret put a hand on my shoulder. "You did that without raising your voice," she said. "I've been doing this for 30 years. You'd be surprised how rare that is." The measurable things came in the weeks after, the way outcomes always do. Thomas's standing in town, the thing he'd protected at my expense for years, simply evaporated. You cannot outrun a courthouse in a town that size. He left within a few months, moved somewhere nobody knew the story yet. He had spent 7 years making sure everyone believed a lie about me. In the end, the truth didn't need me to chase him. It just needed to be said once in the right room. The hospital board didn't make a production of it, which was fine by me. A few weeks after the hearing, the chair asked to meet. He was one of the two who had been in that courtroom, and he had the uncomfortable look of a man who had believed the wrong thing and knew it. He told me the department leadership position was open again. He told me they'd reviewed the matter and found the earlier concerns about my judgment and stability to be without foundation. He didn't quite apologize, but he came close. And from a hospital board, close is generally about as much as you get. I took the job, not because I needed one more thing to win, but because it had been mine, built with my own hands and my own years. And I was not going to let a lie keep it from me one more day. My first week running the department, I walked into the trauma bay and breathed in that clean, antiseptic smell, the one that used to mean safety because it was the only place where nobody called me hollow. It smelled different now. It smelled like somewhere I had earned and gotten back, not somewhere I was hiding. I ran my first code as lead physician with my hands as steady as they had ever been. And afterward, standing at the sink washing up, I caught my reflection in the dark window and didn't recognize the tiredness that used to live in my face. It was gone. People always want to know what happened to everyone after, so let me tell you, and then I'll let you go. Thomas left, like I said. Last I heard, he was somewhere out west, starting over somewhere the story hadn't reached yet. I don't wish him harm. I don't wish him much of anything anymore, which is its own kind of freedom. Donna lost the thing she had built her whole life around, not because I took it from her. I never said a word against her at that church, but because the truth about her son was simply too large to keep out of a town that size. The women's circle she had led for decades quietly moved on without her. I heard she stopped going. I felt a small and genuine sadness about that. The sadness you feel for someone who chose the lie right until it took everything from her. Nina and James worked out the matter of the baby through the courts, the proper way. I hope for that child's sake they found something steady on the other side of it. That little boy didn't ask for any of this. Nina and I never spoke again. Some friendships don't break loudly, they just turn out never to have been what you thought they were, and you set them down with the rest. As for me, I kept the job, kept the apartment, kept the watch on my wrist. I didn't file anything more. I had gotten what I came for. My name was clean, and the truth was standing on its own, and that was enough. There was one more thing I did, and then I was truly done. I wrote Donna a short note. Not a long one, not an angry one. I had thought about her standing in my doorway in her Sunday clothes, a woman who had been lied to by her own son and had chosen the lie anyway, and I found I didn't want to carry any anger toward her into the rest of my life. Anger is just one more bag of stones, so I kept it simple. I won't carry your son's lie anymore, I wrote. You shouldn't either, that was all. I didn't expect a reply. I didn't get one, but writing it closed something that needed to be closed. I slid my grandmother's watch off my wrist that night and held it for a minute, thinking about what she used to say, that patience isn't waiting, it's knowing the right moment when it comes. I had waited 7 years for the right moment. It had come, and I had met it. And now the time that watch had been counting wasn't borrowed against some future reckoning anymore. It was just mine. The whole quiet rest of my life, finally and entirely mine. If you take one thing from my story, let it be this. The truth doesn't shout and it doesn't chase. It just waits, patient as a watch, for the day someone finally stops being afraid and asks the right question out loud. That's my story. 7 years of a name that was never mine and one quiet question that brought the whole thing down. If you've ever been told you were the broken one, let this be the thing you needed to hear tonight. Tell your truth where it counts. Say it once, and then set it down. If this reached you, share it with someone who needs it. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.